So Princess Catherine walked out of the chapel as Meghan approached the pew, and William was left stunned. No argument, no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation. Catherine simply stood up, turned away, and walked through the chapel doors. Honestly, that move said more than any royal statement could have. Catherine was not reacting to where Meghan wanted to sit. She was reacting to what that moment was supposed to make everyone believe. Before we get into why Catherine walked away, make sure you subscribe, because this story gets more complicated once you understand what happened before they entered the chapel. So, here's what actually went down. Meghan believed the family was ready to show unity, while Catherine believed a private boundary had already been crossed. William knew there was tension, but even he did not expect Catherine to make that decision publicly. And that is where this story gets interesting. And this is where the whole thing suddenly became impossible to ignore. Princess Catherine had been sitting quietly inside the chapel when Meghan approached the royal pew. Nothing about the moment needed to become dramatic. Nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had announced a disagreement. From the outside, it could have looked like a normal family gathering where everyone was simply finding their place. But then Catherine stood up. She did not turn toward Meghan and start an argument. She did not make a scene. She simply rose from her seat, looked briefly toward William, and walked away from the pew. And honestly, that was probably more powerful than if she had said something, because everybody inside that room understood what a gesture like that could mean. William watched his wife leave, and for a moment, he looked completely caught off guard. He knew there had been tension. He knew Catherine was uncomfortable with the idea of pretending that everything between the two families had suddenly become normal, but he apparently did not expect her to make that decision right there, in front of everyone. And here's the part that actually gets crazy. Catherine had spent a long time doing exactly the opposite. She had kept her private feelings away from public royal occasions. She had learned to smile when necessary, stand where she was expected to stand, and move through difficult family situations without allowing the tension to become the story. This time, she chose not to do that. She walked. And suddenly, Meghan was left standing near the very place where Catherine had been sitting only moments earlier. Think about what that actually means for a second. Meghan had approached expecting the family to occupy the same space. Catherine saw something completely different. She saw a public gesture that could easily be interpreted as proof that the relationship had been repaired, and according to the story being built around this moment, that was precisely the problem. Catherine did not want a photograph to tell the world that everything was fine when, privately, everything was not fine. William understood that distinction immediately. He remained where he was for a moment, watching Catherine disappear through the doors. His expression changed because he knew this was no longer just an uncomfortable family interaction. Something had crossed from private tension into public view. Harry, meanwhile, was watching Meghan. And Meghan appeared to realize that the situation had gone somewhere neither side had planned. She had not expected Catherine to leave. That matters, because the entire meaning of the moment depended on what happened next. If Catherine had stayed, even reluctantly, cameras could have captured the two women occupying the same royal space. Commentators could have called it a sign of reconciliation. People could have argued that the family was finally moving forward. But Catherine removed herself from that picture completely. And once she did, there was no easy way to put the image back together. Charles also understood the seriousness of the moment. The king had hoped that bringing members of the family together might create a calmer atmosphere. Instead, one quiet decision had exposed just how fragile that idea really was. Nobody needed to say it aloud. The planned image of family unity had disappeared. And the strangest part is that Catherine's walkout may not have been intended as an attack on Meghan at all. It may have been something much more personal, a boundary. Because what happened inside that chapel did not begin when Meghan approached the pew. That conversation had started much earlier, behind closed doors, when Catherine had already made one thing very clear. And Meghan may have believed she understood that conversation completely differently. That is where this story takes a very different turn. Now, here's what makes this even more significant. To someone watching from the outside, Catherine leaving a chapel pew might seem like a small family disagreement. Someone moved toward a seat, someone else decided to leave, and that was it. But inside a royal setting, Moments like that can carry a completely different meaning. A shared appearance can become a message without anyone saying a word. If Catherine and Meghan had remained together, photographs could have shown them sitting side by side. Commentators could have described it as a sign that the family was finally moving forward, and that is exactly why Catherine's decision mattered. She was not simply choosing where to sit. She was choosing whether she wanted to participate in a public image of reconciliation. But here's the thing you need to understand. A public appearance can make people believe something has been repaired long before the people involved actually feel that way. And once that image exists, it becomes almost impossible to take back. Catherine had apparently reached the point where she did not want ceremony deciding the status of a private relationship. That distinction is huge. Because Meghan could look at the same moment and see an opportunity, sitting together could suggest that the family was putting old disagreements behind them. It could make the atmosphere less hostile. It could even create the impression that everyone was willing to start again. Catherine could see the exact same gesture as pressure. If she stayed beside Meghan, people might assume she had forgiven everything. They might assume the relationship had been repaired. They might expect the same closeness at future events. And Catherine was not prepared to make that promise simply by sitting in a particular place. Honestly, that is what makes the situation so complicated. Neither woman necessarily needed to believe she was doing something wrong. Meghan could believe she was helping. Catherine could believe she was protecting herself. And both could walk away from the same moment convinced that the other person had crossed a line. William was stuck directly between those interpretations. He understood why Catherine felt uncomfortable, but he also knew that anything he did publicly could make the situation worse. If he immediately followed Catherine, it could look like he was rejecting Meghan. If he stayed behind too long, Catherine could feel abandoned. So he had to make a decision without turning a private family problem into a larger public confrontation. And Charles faced an even bigger problem. The king had wanted family members to appear together. But wanting unity and creating genuine trust are two completely different things. That is where the plan began to fall apart. Because the closer everyone came physically, the more obvious the emotional distance became. And there was one private conversation before the chapel gathering that explains exactly why Catherine reacted so strongly. Most people watching the walkout would never know that conversation happened. But once you understand what Catherine had already said behind closed doors, her decision inside the chapel starts to look very different. And that is where this story gets much more personal. But to truly understand why Catherine could walk away without hesitation, you have to go back to what happened before that chapel service. Because the boundary was not created that morning, it had already been discussed privately. Catherine and Meghan had apparently spoken behind closed doors after another family gathering. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no audience waiting to interpret every expression. For once, they could speak without worrying about what the public might see. And that conversation started calmly. Meghan explained that she felt every attempt to reconnect was being judged before she even had a chance to explain herself. She wanted the family to stop treating every interaction like a test. Catherine listened, but her answer was very different. She explained that reconciliation could not simply be created by appearing together in public. If the private trust was not there, then a photograph could not magically create it. And honestly, that distinction changed everything. Catherine was not saying that reconciliation was impossible. She was saying that it had to happen privately first. Meghan apparently saw the situation differently. She believed that appearing together could actually help break the tension. If the family stood together, sat together, and behaved normally, perhaps the public pressure would become easier for everyone. That sounds reasonable when you look at it from her side. But Catherine saw a serious problem. Once that image existed, everyone would assume the conflict was over. And if it was not over, Catherine would be placed in the position of having to explain why the public picture did not match reality. That was something she did not want. Then, the conversation reached the issue that would eventually explode inside the chapel. Meghan suggested that the two families should appear together during an upcoming service. She believed it would send a positive message and show that everyone was willing to move forward. Catherine's response was reportedly clear. She did not want their relationship turned into a public performance. She wanted private trust before public symbolism. That may have sounded like a simple request at the time, but it became extremely important later. Because Meghan left that conversation believing she had been asked to slow down, Catherine believed she had made a firm boundary unmistakably clear. Those are not the same thing. And that difference sat quietly between them until the chapel gathering. William knew Catherine had concerns. He had heard enough to understand why she did not want to be placed beside Meghan simply for the sake of appearances. But even William may not have realized how seriously Catherine had taken that private conversation. Then Meghan approached the pew. From her perspective, it may have looked like an opportunity to demonstrate unity. From Catherine's perspective, it may have looked like the exact public gesture she had already asked her not to make. And that is why Catherine's reaction was so immediate. She was not deciding what to do in that moment. She had already decided, weeks earlier. The chapel simply gave her the situation she had hoped would never happen. But there was one problem nobody had fully considered. Meghan may not have believed she was ignoring Catherine at all. She may have believed someone else had given her permission to make that exact gesture, and that person was much closer to the center of the royal family than anyone expected. And this is the detail that makes the entire chapel incident much more complicated. Meghan may not have walked toward that royal pew believing she was deliberately crossing Catherine's boundary. She may have believed she was doing exactly what the family wanted, but that distinction matters. Because the plan, if we can call it that, was actually pretty simple. Create one visible moment of family unity. Let everyone sit together, behave normally, and allow the public to see that the relationship was moving forward. No dramatic announcement. No formal statement. Just proximity. And honestly, that is what made the idea so powerful. A single photograph of Catherine and Meghan sitting together could have created an entirely different story around the family. People would have seen two women who had spent years surrounded by tension suddenly occupying the same space. Commentators would have immediately started talking about reconciliation. The image could have become proof that the family was finally putting old disagreements behind them. From Meghan's perspective, that could have looked like progress. But Catherine had a completely different concern. She knew that once the photograph existed, nobody would ask whether the private relationship had actually been repaired. They would simply assume it had. And that would create pressure for everyone to keep performing the same closeness afterward. This is where Charles becomes important. The king wanted the family to appear united. He believed that getting everyone into the same room could help reduce the distance between them. The problem was that his message was apparently broad enough to be interpreted in different ways. Meghan could hear, "Show, the family is together." Catherine could hear, "Do not pretend something has been repaired when it has not." Those two ideas collided at exactly the wrong moment. Harry supported Meghan's interpretation. From his perspective, if the family had been encouraged to appear together, then Meghan had little reason to believe that approaching the pew would cause a confrontation. William understood Catherine's position, and suddenly the brothers were looking at the same situation from completely different sides. That is why the plan almost worked. Everything depended on Catherine accepting the public gesture. If she had remained seated, the image would have been created automatically, but she did not. She recognized the meaning of the moment before anyone else could control it, and when she stood up, the entire plan collapsed. The interesting part is that nobody needed to be plotting something sinister for this to happen. A vague message from Charles, a private boundary from Catherine, Meghan's desire to show progress, and Harry's belief that reconciliation was possible were enough. That is how family conflicts become explosive. Nobody thinks they are starting a war. Everyone thinks they are responding to someone else's decision. But then came the question William could not ignore. Had Meghan knowingly ignored Catherine's warning? Or had Charles's message made her believe she was actually following the family's wishes? That answer would change how William understood everything he had just witnessed. And once he learned what Charles had actually said, the entire situation looked different. Okay, so here's the part that actually changes everything. William had watched Catherine walk away, believing he understood why she had done it. From his perspective, the boundary was clear. Catherine had already explained that she did not want a public display of reconciliation before the private relationship had been repaired. So when Meghan approached the pew, William initially assumed she had ignored that boundary. But then he learned something he had not known. Charles had encouraged the family to appear together. Not specifically in that exact seat. Not as a direct instruction to Meghan, but the king had made it clear that he wanted the family to show some visible unity during the gathering, and that changed the entire picture. Because Meghan apparently believed she was responding to that encouragement. She was not necessarily thinking, "I'm going to ignore Catherine." She may have been thinking, "This is what the family has asked us to do." And honestly, that is the detail that makes the situation much harder to reduce to a simple argument between two people. William, now, had two different versions of the same event. Catherine believed a private boundary had been crossed. Meghan believed she was responding to a message from the king, and Charles suddenly realized that his own attempt to create unity may have helped create the confrontation. That was the uncomfortable part. Nobody had needed to give Meghan a direct order. All it took was a vague expectation. Charles wanted everyone to look united. Meghan interpreted that as an opportunity to move closer. Catherine interpreted the same kind of public gesture as something she had specifically asked to avoid. And there they were, inside the chapel, with both women acting according to completely different understandings of what was expected. William had to process that quickly. He could defend Catherine without turning Meghan into an enemy. He could recognize Meghan's misunderstanding without telling Catherine that her boundary did not matter. And he could not simply blame Charles without making the king's attempt at reconciliation look like a complete failure. That left William with a difficult choice. The easiest thing would have been to pick a side publicly, but that would have made the situation much worse. If William immediately confronted Meghan, the story would become a royal family attack. If he forced Catherine back into the chapel, he would effectively tell her that keeping the peace mattered more than the boundary she had already established. So, he chose neither. He focused on stopping the situation from becoming bigger. And this is where William's response became much more important than Catherine's walkout itself. Because he was about to make a quiet decision that would prevent the palace from turning one uncomfortable moment into an even bigger public spectacle. No speech, no confrontation, no dramatic statement. Just one decision about what happened next. And Meghan had absolutely no idea that the family gathering was about to change because of it. And this is where William made the decision that quietly changed everything. He did not confront Meghan. He did not demand an explanation in front of the family. And he certainly did not turn Catherine's walkout into a public punishment. Instead, William focused on one thing: stopping the situation from getting any worse. He understood that Catherine had already made her position clear. Forcing her back into the chapel would only make her feel that her boundary meant nothing. But William also understood something else. If Meghan was genuinely acting on Charles's encouragement, then treating her like she had deliberately created the confrontation would be unfair. So, William chose the middle ground. He supported Catherine privately while making sure there would be no forced reunion for the rest of the gathering. And honestly, that was probably the smartest move available. The palace did not need another carefully arranged photograph. It did not need Catherine and Meghan standing beside each other simply because everyone wanted the public to believe the family was united. So, the schedule was quietly adjusted. Separate movements. Separate conversations. No forced greeting. No staged moment designed to convince anyone that everything had suddenly been repaired. That may sound like a small decision, but it mattered. Because once William removed the pressure to create a public reconciliation, everyone could finally stop reacting to the cameras. Catherine did not have to return to the chapel. Meghan did not have to pretend she had not been embarrassed. Harry did not have to immediately defend his wife. And Charles did not have to force everyone back into the same room. For the first time that day, nobody was being asked to perform unity. Think about what that means. The entire problem had started because a public gesture was being treated as evidence of private progress. William simply removed the gesture from the equation. He also spoke privately with Charles. The message was straightforward. If reconciliation was ever going to happen, it could not be arranged through seating plans or public appearances. Trust had to come first. Charles reportedly understood the point. His intention had been to bring the family closer, but the result had been the opposite. William then made sure Harry understood that he was not trying to humiliate Meghan. That mattered, because the brothers were already carrying years of tension between them. One angry exchange could have turned a difficult family moment into another permanent division. So William refused to escalate. He protected Catherine without attacking Meghan, and that is the difference between a reaction and a strategy. Catherine had walked away because she reached her limit. William now had to decide what happened after that. He chose restraint, but there was still one problem nobody could control. The chapel had cameras. People had seen Catherine leave. And even if the family remained completely silent afterward, that image was already out there. The public would not see the private misunderstanding. They would not hear Charles's explanation. They would not know what Catherine had said weeks earlier. They would see one thing: Catherine walking away as Meghan approached. And that image was about to become much bigger than anyone inside the chapel expected. And here's where the entire situation became impossible to hide. Nobody inside the chapel needed to make an announcement. Nobody needed to explain what had just happened. The image had already been created. Catherine had stood up. She had turned away from the royal pew, and she had walked through the chapel doors while Meghan remained behind. To an outsider, that might look like nothing more than an awkward family moment. But in the world of the royal family, a gesture like that can become a message all by itself. And honestly, that is what made the moment so powerful. Catherine did not point at Meghan. She did not say anything. She did not even appear to want attention. She simply left. But the meaning people attached to that movement was immediate. Some saw it as rejection. Others saw it as Catherine protecting a personal boundary. And still others saw it as proof that the family had not repaired the relationship everyone wanted them to believe was improving. That is the strange thing about public royal moments. The people watching from outside rarely know what happened before the cameras arrived. They see the gesture, they create the explanation, and then that explanation becomes the story. Inside the chapel, the people involved understood that something much more complicated had happened. William knew why Catherine had left. Harry knew Meghan had not expected the reaction. Charles knew his attempt to encourage unity had failed, and Meghan was left dealing with the most difficult part of all. She could not explain the private conversation that had happened before the service without exposing something the family had deliberately kept private. So, she remained quiet. Catherine faced the same problem. If she explained exactly why she had walked away, she would have to reveal private details about the relationship. If she stayed silent, people could decide for themselves what her silence meant. And that is exactly what happened. The image began to carry a meaning far larger than the moment itself. Suddenly, the chapel doors were no longer just the place Catherine had walked through. They became the visual dividing line between two sides of a family that had spent years struggling to find common ground. But here's the thing: Catherine may have walked away from Meghan. William did not walk away from the problem. He understood that the next few hours could determine whether this became a private disagreement or another major family rupture. So palace staff quietly adjusted the movements around the gathering. No forced photographs, no carefully arranged reunion, no moment designed to make everyone stand together for the cameras. That decision told its own story. The family was no longer trying to make the public believe everything was fine. They were giving everyone space. And perhaps that was the first genuinely honest thing that happened that day. Because sometimes the most revealing royal moment is not when people stand together. It is when they finally stop pretending that they can. But the public had already seen the walkout. And once that image escaped the chapel, the family could no longer control what people believed it meant. The question was no longer whether Catherine had left. Everyone had seen that. The real question was what happened after she walked away. And that was where the consequences became much harder to contain. And this is where the damage from that single moment really started to spread. The palace had a choice. It could explain exactly why Catherine walked out, reveal the private disagreement, and try to control the public reaction. Or it could stay quiet. They chose silence. And honestly, that was probably the only realistic option. Because the moment the palace started explaining private conversations, the story would become even bigger. Every sentence would create another question. Every explanation would give people another detail to argue about. So there was no dramatic statement. No public accusation, no attempt to blame Meghan. Instead, the family quietly separated their movements for the rest of the gathering. Catherine stayed away from another forced encounter. Meghan remained with Harry. William moved between private conversations, and Charles was left dealing with the uncomfortable reality that his attempt to create unity had produced exactly the opposite result. The problem was that the public did not see any of that. They saw Catherine walking away. That was enough. Commentators began asking why she had left. People started interpreting the gesture from completely different perspectives. Some believed Catherine had deliberately humiliated Meghan. Others believed Meghan had crossed a boundary. And some argued that the entire situation proved the royal family was still deeply divided. The truth was much less simple. Catherine did not appear to have planned a public confrontation. Meghan did not necessarily believe she was provoking one. Charles had wanted unity. William wanted stability. Harry wanted to protect Meghan. Everyone was reacting to a different version of the same situation, and that is where the original reconciliation plan completely collapsed. The public image Charles wanted was supposed to show the family moving forward. Instead, the image showed exactly how difficult that process still was. Catherine felt the weight of it almost immediately. She knew that walking out had protected her from a situation she did not want to participate in, but she also knew how the moment could look from the outside. She did not want Meghan to believe the walkout had been intended as humiliation. At the same time, she was not willing to pretend she had no reason for leaving. Meghan faced the opposite problem. She believed she had been trying to move closer to the family, yet the public image made it look as though she had been rejected. Harry was angry, but even he understood that responding publicly could make everything worse. William reached the same conclusion. He told Catherine that explaining every private detail would only turn the moment into another round of public accusations, and he urged everyone involved to leave the chapel incident where it belonged, behind closed doors. That decision stopped the situation from becoming an immediate public war, but it did not repair the relationship. In fact, something more important had happened. The family had finally seen the limits of staged reconciliation. Charles could not simply put everyone in the same room and expect trust to appear. William could not protect Catherine by controlling every public interpretation. Meghan could not create a peaceful image without knowing whether Catherine was ready to participate. And Catherine could not protect her boundary without accepting that the public would judge the decision. Everyone had lost something, but nobody had lost more than the illusion that appearances could fix the problem. And there was still one conversation left. A private conversation with no cameras, no husbands, no palace staff, and no royal ceremony to hide behind. That meeting would determine whether the chapel walkout became the beginning of another permanent rupture, or the moment when both women finally understood what had actually gone wrong. And then came the conversation nobody outside that family could have staged for them. Catherine and Meghan agreed to speak privately. No cameras, no William, no Harry, no Charles, no palace staff waiting nearby to interpret every sentence. Just the two women who had been standing on opposite sides of the same misunderstanding. And, honestly, that mattered more than another photograph ever could. Catherine explained that walking out of the chapel had not been about humiliating Meghan. She had felt cornered by a public gesture that seemed to suggest a reconciliation she was not ready to claim. She wanted the freedom to decide what their relationship meant before anyone else decided it for them. Meghan listened. Then she explained why she had approached the pew. She believed the family wanted to show unity. She believed that sitting together could be a small step toward repairing the relationship. She had not understood Catherine's private warning in the same way. That admission changed the tone of the conversation, because suddenly both women could see how the same moment had produced completely different meanings. Catherine had seen a boundary being crossed. Meghan had seen an opportunity being offered. Neither interpretation completely explained what happened, but together, they explained why the situation had exploded so quickly. Catherine did not suddenly forgive everything. Meghan did not suddenly forget everything that had happened before. There was no dramatic embrace, no emotional speech, no promise that they would suddenly become close. Instead, Catherine made a much smaller point. If they were ever going to rebuild trust, they could not use royal ceremonies to pretend it already existed. Meghan agreed. And that was probably the most important thing either woman could have said. Because the chapel incident had exposed the problem perfectly, they had been trying to communicate through gestures instead of conversations. Catherine's walkout was a gesture. Meghan approaching the pew was a gesture. Charles encouraging the family to appear together was another gesture. Everyone was sending messages without actually agreeing on what those messages meant. This private conversation finally removed the performance. They could disagree without an audience. They could admit mistakes without worrying about headlines. And they could acknowledge something neither side had wanted to say publicly. And the chapel moment had hurt both of them. Catherine regretted that her decision had been interpreted as deliberate humiliation. Meghan accepted that approaching the pew after their earlier conversation had placed Catherine under pressure. Neither woman surrendered. Neither woman won. But both finally understood the difference between intention and impact. And that was enough to change what happened next. End quote. Before leaving, the two women crossed paths again. This time there was no dramatic movement. Catherine gave Meghan a small nod. Meghan returned it. Then they went in different directions. To someone watching from outside, that might seem insignificant. But after everything that had happened, it was the first gesture that did not demand anything from the other person. No performance, no promise, no claim that everything was fixed, just recognition. And that was when the chapel walkout stopped being the end of the story. It became the moment when everyone finally understood that reconciliation could not be forced. But the larger question remained. What did this actually reveal about the royal family and about the kind of future William was preparing to build? When you step back and look at everything that happened, this was never really about a chapel pew. It was about something much harder to fix: trust. Charles wanted the family to look united. Meghan believed a public gesture could help move everyone closer together. Catherine believed the opposite. She believed that public appearances could not repair private damage that had never been properly addressed. And that difference explains the entire confrontation. Catherine walked away because she refused to let a ceremony decide what her relationship with Meghan meant. Meghan approached the pew because she believed she was helping create the unity the family wanted. William was left in the middle, forced to protect his wife's boundary without turning the moment into another public family battle. And Charles had to confront an uncomfortable lesson. You cannot create reconciliation simply by putting people in the same room. That is not how trust works. The most important thing William did was not choosing Catherine over Meghan. It was refusing to let the conflict become bigger. He did not demand an apology in front of everyone. Unquote. He did not attack Harry. He did not publicly blame Meghan. He simply removed the pressure to perform unity before the family was ready for it. And honestly, that may have been the most mature response available. Because the easy version of this story would be to pick a winner. Catherine walked out, so Catherine won. Meghan was left behind, so Meghan lost. But real family conflicts rarely work that neatly. Catherine gained control over her boundary. But she also had to accept that her decision would be publicly misunderstood. Meghan lost control of the moment, but she also gained a clearer understanding of why Catherine reacted so strongly. Charles lost the image of effortless family unity he wanted. William gained something more useful: clarity. He learned that future reconciliation cannot depend on carefully arranged appearances. It has to begin privately, and that may be the biggest lesson from the entire incident. For years, royal life has depended heavily on appearances. Where people stand, who they greet, who sits beside whom, who walks with whom, all of it can become part of the story. But appearances only work when the reality underneath them can support the image. If the trust is missing, the image eventually breaks. That is exactly what happened inside the chapel. One person tried to create a symbol of unity. Another person refused to participate in that symbol, and suddenly, everyone could see the distance that had been hidden behind ceremony. The final gesture was not a hug. It was not a grand apology. It was that small nod between Catherine and Meghan. Because for once, neither woman was pretending. They were not claiming everything was fixed. They were simply acknowledging each other and walking forward. And perhaps that was more honest than any staged royal photograph could ever be. The chapel did not produce the perfect reconciliation Charles wanted. It produced something much more uncomfortable. It forced the family to admit that public unity means nothing without private trust. And that is the real lesson from what happened. You cannot stage reconciliation when the trust behind it is still broken.